Hello and welcome to part 2 of whether moral obligation and assisting people in need should go hand to hand. In case you haven't seen part 1, I will link it somewhere, I promise you. And then this second segment will deal with whether the government should have a moral obligation to assist the people in need, why and why not. Just as I presented in my first segment, I have a bunch of ideas here on the board. Let's go over the pro sides first. Again, a lot of things that I mentioned in the first video can cross apply here, so I'm trying to be more diverse but yet still cover the same types of arguments. This one is somewhat repetitive. On the pro side, we have utilitarianism again, the most good for the most amount of people, increasing happiness, maximizing welfare. However, through a governmental perspective, we obviously have a different approach to utilitarianism, and this approach says that make it legal. Make it legal for people to assist people in need. That is the way the government displays its moral obligation to assist others. Now, obviously, there's a lot of pros and cons to this plan or policy. However, let's examine as to why it's a good policy from a utilitarian perspective. If you make something legal, psychologically, people are more likely to perform that specific action, and I had studies on that. And then essentially, if you make it legal, then people are doing it more often. The government fulfill the assistance of people in need. People unto themselves now legally are obligated to assist people in need, and by doing so you increase welfare because you are helping others, helping people good. But then some people argue that actually decreases happiness because once you make something legal and it's an obligation, you make it a chore, that decreases happiness of people because if you make people do stuff that they don't want to do, they're less happy. So it's this make it legal to assist people in need is a double-edged sword, but ultimately who cares because we assist the people in need, and then that's in itself good. Moving on to another idea. It says that it actually is the government's job to help people. This will be cross-applied to the con/negative side as well, whether the government should or should not have the duty to assist people in need into itself. The pro side obviously argues that it should. I mean, look at welfare. That's probably the one and only example that I can think of. Probably Medicare or Medicaid somehow has a tangent into the government helping people in need, obviously in need of healthcare, versus private companies. And just looking back at it's the government's job. Look at welfare. The government already helps the needy from a financial perspective, so might as well just extend on that and make it more obligatory to continue the pursuit of assisting people in need through welfare, or try to apply a different policy that satisfies a different kind of need that's like differently cost efficient or cost just economic impact. Moving on to another idea is that the government represents the voice of the people, or this is more like the spiritual side of things, that the government reflects the soul of the society. So therefore, if the society wants to help people in need, the government ought to also encourage the assistance of people in need by making it more obligatory for people. Then again, people might argue this is why the pro side from the governmental perspective is not something that people should argue, because in my personal opinion it doesn't make any sense. As far as you've seen throughout these arguments, it kind of lacks a sort of fundamental ideology. So moving back to the government represents the voice of the people. Okay, what if the people don't want to assist people in need, so it kind of turns into itself? You can't always say that just because the people reflect the government indirectly or in one way or another, that means that the government in itself has a moral obligation to assist people in need. Okay, now this pro is really iffy. I apologize. I was just trying to find some specific way in which to frame a moral obligation for the government. I personally believe that the government should not have the moral obligation to assist people in need. Moving on to the con side, which is probably far easier to argue. One of the main arguments that you can punish people for not helping. I brought this up in my previous speech, if I remember correctly. You can't just be like, okay, so the government is going to install a policy that says you have to help people, and if you don't, we're just going to send you to jail, or, you know, make you do some sort of action that restores this legal system. So it's kind of iffy. Then moving on, just as I brought up in the pro side, but in the con side seems more fit, which is it's not the government's job to help others in need. The government ought to deal with other things that are more significant to the population, for example, education and transportation and many other things that have a higher importance in the society. The government shouldn't even bother with the needy because there are other things that we should take care of first, and therefore the government should not have the moral obligation to assist people in need. Moving on to the prevention principle, it's essentially more of an impact analysis of whether or not it's morally obligatory. Let's just say hypothetically, for example, it is morally obligatory for the government to assist people in need. How exactly is this going to work and play out in the society? I mean, for example, are the people just going to donate to the government and then the government in a socialistic manner are going to redistribute the goods? Or, I mean, even if you're trying to make things throughout the government, usually it doesn't work because you have to consider whether the people in need will actually get the help. The government is corrupt, they might keep the money for themselves, or, you know, all these kinds of things that if you have the government as a middleman, there's a high chance that it's not going to work. Therefore, I personally believe that there should not essentially be some sort of like moral obligation for the government to assist people in need. It doesn't make any sense. There are some pros, I guess. There's always pros and cons to every situation. However, in this specific context, the con outweighs the pros. You can't just say that, okay, so there's this specific ideology that, hey, helping people is cool, so let's just make the government do this as well, and then the government's like, hey, no, we have to deal with other stuff. So therefore, I mean, this was more of an iffy video, but we have to also analyze things from an individual as well as from a governmental perspective. I mean, obviously there are charities like Goodwill and whatnot. There are things that are going on in the status quo that clearly show that people do like to assist people in need. However, if you make it an obligation, it's kind of diminishing the value of assisting people in need, which sucks in itself. So therefore, assisting people in need would be bad. However, I have a really cool ideology by Peter Singer, which is a utilitarian philosopher. Usually I base some of my actions based on this, and this can cross-apply to the government as well as individuals. It's called the strong Singer principle, and it goes as follows. If it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. This essentially saying that by without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, he means without causing anything else comparably bad to happen, or doing something that is wrong in itself, or failing to promote some moral good comparable in significance to the bad thing that we can prevent. This clearly shows this is obviously not a relative argument, because this comparable moral importance is obviously a scale, and what's more important to you might not be important to somebody else. So this is why the scale only applies to the individual as it's in its own authority. So you can't say that according to my moral scale, what you're doing is wrong, say Singer principle and whatnot, because in their opinion, and this is why you know, when you watch like crime shows and whatnot, in their minds the criminals don't think they were at fault, because in their minds the thing that they did is outweighs the thing that they ought not to do. So therefore in their mind what they did is perfectly moral, it's totally okay. This relativist argument, it kind of applies specifically just to actions that are more like obvious, I guess, like pro-life versus anti-life. But that's not a iffy subject, because then we get into abortion and pros and cons. That's a different topic. If you'd like me to elaborate on that, I'd be more than happy to make another video. That's essentially it. As wrap-ups, this will mainly be my personal conclusion. From an individual perspective, I think that we should not have the moral obligation to assist people in need, because you can't tell other people what to do. I can tell myself to have a moral obligation to assist people in need. This can be part of my personal philosophy, this can go along with my religion, this can go along with something that I value, as for example charity. However, I cannot tell somebody else to assist people in need. This kind of goes hand in hand with the government. The government should, I personally believe, deal with other things that are more significant, that have a higher impact in the society, making infrastructure more better and such. So I think more obligation to assist somebody in need, regardless of whether it's from an individual perspective or a governmental perspective, should not happen. Obligation is usually a bad word. If you want to help somebody, you can go ahead and do so. Nobody's going to stop you. However, you cannot force somebody else to do it. So that's essentially my personal opinion. So peace, have a good night, or good morning in case you're watching this, or good afternoon. Goodbye.